Voice of Geekdom is now on Patreon. Please check out the link in the description to find out how you could gain access to premium content and social features. Hello Tolkien geeks, and welcome to the Voice of Geekdom podcast. This is another episode in the mini-series that I've been enjoying producing here on the channel on the free peoples of Middle-earth. And this time we're here to talk about the Dwarves. We have two new debutantes to the channel for you today. On my right is a long-time friend of the channel, although this is the first time we've ever spoken face-to-face. It's Matt from Nerd of the Rings, which has just recently, in the last couple of months, I think, become the biggest Lord of the Rings lore channel on YouTube. So congratulations to Matt. Matt is a self-acknowledged huge fan of Tolkien's dwarves and often leads the charge in defending the dwarves from many of the slanderous elf lovers out there. On the bottom of your screen is the Dwarrow scholar, Roy. Roy streams on Twitch, blogs regularly, and has a YouTube channel of his own. And mostly he's known for the study and proliferation of Neo-Khuzdul, which is sort of the extension of Tolkien's dwarvish language for the use of fans and creators and so on across the fandom, which I think is really, really interesting. And I want to ask you a few questions about that, because I think you're the only person I've ever heard of doing that. It makes sense that there are people out there doing that, but it's something that I've just never really dug into. So I'd be interested in learning about that. Sure. But with all of my guests on this mini-series so far, I've kind of started out with just asking you straight off the bat, why the dwarves? Why a dwarf is important and special for you? Mm-hmm. And how did you come to love them? So I want to start with you, Roy, because you are the Dwarrow scholar. And so it makes sense to get your perspective on that. And why did you pick dwarves as something to be so fascinated by and to put so much of your time into as a creator?
It's kind of a tough one to start with, to be honest, because it's something that grew gradually, I would say. And the love kind of started with the love of Tolkien's works in general, and then, faded toward the dwarves, and eventually kind of became an old-time hobby, I would say, that, if you ask my wife, she would say a little bit too much time, but takes up a lot of time. But anyway, how I got into that was, like many, I would say, with getting a book from somebody. In this case, it was my uncle, who said, "Yeah, read this. You're gonna like this," and he was right. And started reading The Hobbit, feverishly several times over a summer. And I think the first spark of loving dwarves, having that interest and having that passion, probably was in the Hobbit, the chapter where Thorin and company arrive in Rivendell, and the elves tralalalali kind of make fun of them. And, that making fun of them, that wasn't really cool with me. So, that opened the door for me to, for the Dwarvish Appreciation Club, I would say. Yeah.
They did also make fun of Bilbo. And
yes,
to be fair, they're equally, frivolous and dismissive of their their Hobbit companion.
Right.
How about yourself, Matt? How did you sort of first see the dwarves, and how did you come to love the dwarves, and what do they mean to you as a fan of Tolkien's works?
Yeah. This is, like Roy said, a tricky question, because I feel like my road through Tolkien fandom has been such a kind of a blur. It all kind of meshes together, but I was actually introduced to Tolkien through the films. So, I have to think that part of that comes from John Rhys Davies playing Gimli. I think, I know not everyone's a fan of the comic relief aspect of Gimli. I just love that character. And, something about how hardy they are, and he's just always up for, whatever, battle they're facing and everything.
Yeah.
I guess he does hesitate when they go through the paths of the dead, but who wouldn't?
That is right out of the books, though. He does in the books,
yeah,
too.
absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, it makes him kind of relatable. Like, I'd hesitate too. But from there, I read the books, and, it's interesting. Like, one of the things I love about Tolkien is that he doesn't explain everything. Like, there's mysteries in Tolkien's world, and the dwarves are one of those more mysterious people. They're very private. They kind of relate to my introvert nature myself. It's like I'm okay with dwelling in my dark cave. I'll come out once in a while, and see the sun and everything, but other than that, I'm kind of content to stay at home in my cave. But
like collecting lots of gold and shiny objects and weapons. And
well, there's definitely a lack of gold in my particular cave, but I guess maybe I haven't delved too deep enough. But yeah, from that, I was really excited when they were making the Hobbit films that we'd get to see more dwarves. I just remember that being really exciting. I wish we would have gotten to know those dwarves more and better, especially in the later films. But yeah, there's just something about them that, their hardiness and their ferocity. They're just, they stand out when you compare them, especially to the elves. They
do really stand out. That's true.
Yeah. And I always related to them more because I knew, if I were ever, portraying, not that this would ever happen, but if I were ever portraying a race of Middle Earth, I would not be cast as an elf. I do not have the build, the grace, the physique, any of that. But a dwarf I could pull off. I'm like, okay. Yeah. We've got some commonality here.
Yeah, for me, I'm a big fan of the Silmarillion, and people who know me know that I cover the Silmarillion in a lot of depth on my channel. When I think about the Silmarillion dwarves, I think a lot about how they're always there, but they're not really a big part of the storyline. But they're always there as a kind of counterpoint to remind you that this is an elvish story. And whenever we get mentions of the dwarves, I always think about the meta aspects of the way that the story is told, and the fact that this is an elvish story that's being told with an elvish slant. We get told that the dwarves are kind of ugly and their language is cumbersome and unlovely, and we get kind of the elvish slant on that, which I find really interesting as a Silmarillion fan. So that's my take on the dwarves. Really, is that they're really useful as a narrative device in that particular story. And then, of course, The Hobbit, as you mentioned, Roy, I was introduced to Tolkien through The Hobbit. I was just talking to my dad about this the other night, actually, because he read The Hobbit to me while I was in hospital, when I was 8 years old. And he read The Hobbit to me, and all of the other kids in the ward ended up all listening to him read me The Hobbit, which I'd never even, I think I'd forgotten that story until he told me that the other night, which was fun. But yeah, so I've always identified with the dwarves ever since then. And The Hobbit is the one story of Tolkien's which is, it's told through Hobbit eyes, but it's also a dwarven story. It's a dwarven quest to recover the ancestral home of the dwarves. And that's where we get the Norse influence come in as well. I think it's probably the area of Tolkien's works which is most directly influenced by a mythological inspiration, in a more pronounced way, in as much as the names themselves come directly from the Poetic Edda. Any thoughts on that? You've
touched on one in particular, which is the names of the dwarves in the company. I mean, even Gandalf came from the Poetic Edda. All, I believe, apart from Balin, which was Tolkien's invention, the rest was directly from the Edda. But then there's, for instance, the Dwarvish runes, which are based on Old Norse Futhark runes. And there's little elements like, for instance, the ravens are messengers in Old Norse traditions, but you also see ravens used as messengers for the dwarves, and as allies, even to a certain extent. Tolkien even uses the connection often is hidden. For instance, you have what I would call a myth within myth connection, where he says the men of Middle Earth believe dwarves to be from stone, right? Which, again, this is, a link to the Old Norse elements where, the creation myth there, where you had the giant Ymir that was slain, body became the earth, and the maggots, the stone maggots, if you will, were the Dvergar, the dwarves. So this whole myth that the men of Middle Earth then think, the dwarves are from stone, is a little bit of a wink toward the Old Norse mythology there. Which is nice. It's hidden away, but still it's there, even though he later says, Gimli says, well, that's obviously not true, etc., etc. And it's also mentioned in the appendices that the concept is ridiculous, But of course, it's a myth within a myth in the story, and that's one of the things I like. It's nicely done, hiding away these little gems, if you will.
And with Tolkien, you can't always tell what's myth and what isn't. And I think the dwarves are a good example of that. And also the myth about where they're going at the end of the world. The whole myth about them being Aule's special helpers that are going to help him rebuild the new world in Arda Unmarred.
Yes,
which is a dwarvish myth within the myth. Which is an interesting one. I don't know whether that has any direct correlation in Northern legends. I don't know that it does. Obviously, Ragnarok is a Northern legend, which you can talk about, but I don't know whether that's actually connected to anything.
I wouldn't think so per se. No, I mean there are some similarities, but it's not like it's that blatant that it's one-on-one connection. No, I wouldn't say so.
No, and things usually aren't, are they, with Tolkien? But yeah. I'm going to talk about the origins of the dwarves, which we've already touched on a little bit, which is specifically with the Aulë and Yavanna chapter in the Silmarillion, which I think is really interesting, because one of the things that we've already said is that the dwarves they stand out, and that there's a reason for that. Tolkien gives us a reason for that, which is that they weren't built by the creator god; they were built by Aulë. And although you'd have to think they were part of the plan in some sense, they weren't built by the god. They were built by Aulë. And Eru comes down and he's hopping mad, and then he says, actually, I can see that this means a lot to you, and voila, your creations now have life. And he gives them the flame imperishable. And he imbues them with life. But that also separates them from the other races. And he says they will never get along well with men and elves. They will always have some strife there. What do you think that, what kind of effect do you think that creates? Let's go to Matt, because it's definitely a retcon, because that was written after the Lord of the Rings, but it also explains a lot of what we've seen with the dwarves up until that point, and it makes them distinct from the other races. What do you think Tolkien was doing when he did that?
Gosh, I don't. I try not to guess what Tolkien was thinking too much, because I'm probably wrong. He's probably thinking on like a whole nother 3D chess level than I ever would. But I do love, this idea that, like, I always think of the biblical story of Abraham and his sons Ishmael and Isaac. And it's kind of like like Abraham, Aulë is impatient for the children of Iluvatar to show up, and out of that impatience, he creates his own, children, and much like Abraham with Ishmael, and like there's obviously it's not a 1-for-1 allegory or anything like that, but then the scene where Aulë is told to destroy, or offers to destroy his creation, is very much like again Abraham and Isaac when he's about to sacrifice Isaac, and then God stops him, and here Eru stops him. So I love those parallels where you see kind of Tolkien's faith, inspiring his work. And I absolutely love the line where Iluvatar says, where he explains like there's going to be strife between these two. And I believe he uses the phrase, the children of my adoption and the children of my creation. So like, as a father who's adopted, like I love that language of, these are my adopted children. So, so that's a one small point that kind of, gets me going when the elves belittle the dwarves. It's like, hey, they're not created by Iluvatar, but they're his children, they're adopted by Iluvatar.
And from firsthand experience that an adopted child is a child that's still loved.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And that's why Eru says that.
Yeah. So I'm sure Eru's on the same page when he's like, hey, elves, maybe chill a little bit here. But yeah, I love that whole phrase. Sorry, I'm like going off on a rabbit trail here. I've got forgetting where I'm supposed to circle back to on this. I think your original question was something about what Tolkien intended.
Yeah, what did he intend with Aulë and Yavanna?
Yeah,
I mean, we're here to have these kinds of tangents. That's what we're all about on this channel. So don't worry about that.
Well, yeah, and it is interesting you bring up Yavanna, because she is the one who's in tune with nature and the forest and everything, and that's what brings about the Ents is her fear that like these short people over here are gonna chop up all my trees. So they end up creating the Ents, and like so the creation of the dwarves obviously has some pretty big ripple effects.
Of course, over the whole history of Arda, the men are going to cut down a lot more trees than anybody else.
Yeah,
but
those Numenorians.
Yeah, it's part of the music, isn't it? And I think it proves that the dwarves were part of the music because that prompts Yavanna to have that reaction, and that's the music having that counterpoint and swinging back around to Eru's greater glory. One thing I wanted to touch on a little bit was how the dwarves have changed over the course of the legendarium, and how Tolkien kind of changed his mind about things, and how things were retconned. Certainly before and after The Hobbit, and also before and after The Lord of the Rings, I think the dwarves changed quite a lot. Probably more than any of the other three peoples, actually. They play a different role in the early Silmarillion stuff than they do in the later Silmarillion stuff. And also, I think the Lord of the Rings definitely changes them. Although they play a smallish role in the Lord of the Rings, it definitely changes them. How do you think that happened, and how did that kind of come about over the course of the decades that Tolkien was writing? Let's start with Roy on this one.
Well, I think there's, I would say, 4 main stages of, Tolkien's dwarves. If people talk about Tolkien's dwarves, you kind of need to always ask, what exactly, what dwarf are we talking about here? Because they start off as pretty wicked, evil creatures. Fangluin Bluebeard is a very good example of that, from the Book of Lost Tales. A very wicked, evil dwarf. There's no good traits to be found there. Then you have, in the later stage, you have in the Hobbit, they are rather cowardly at times. They push Bilbo down the steps toward the dragon. There, off you go. Good luck to you. While then, later with Gimli, you see some strong heroic traits coming up, which you did not see as often in The Hobbit. Let me put it that way.
I feel as though Gimli was almost an apology for some of those earlier stories.
Well, yes. Well, to some extent, perhaps, yes. And then the last stage, I would say, is what we see in the Unfinished Tales, where the Quest of Erebor, you see that they overall have a good disposition. They have a good heart. They value bonds of friendship. So they're fleshed out more as well. If you see,
that's where we learn more about the different tribes as well. Of course, we learn about the Longbeards and the rest of them.
So if you see, they came from a more or less two-dimensional character to becoming very fleshed out, very in-depth, very, various aspects of who they are had been worked out by those later stages. And that's, I think, again, who knows, but I think it made it, if you flesh out a character to such an extent, you can't make them black or white. You can't make them, very good, very evil only. You have to make them, human, quote unquote. They have to have elements of both in them. And I think that is something that we gradually see happening, where, they were very simple, two-dimensional, then they kind of developed more, got some traits, you got more info on them, and when you get to that fourth stage, that's the dwarves that I would say you could be proud of.
Yeah, it's a good place to point people towards people who are non-Tolkien people who don't get it, and the kind of people who say Tolkien is all black and white, and that's why I can't get into it, because it's all good versus evil, black versus white, and it's the dwarves are not at all. I don't think any of the races are particularly, but the dwarves are a good place to point to when it comes to that. So it's interesting. It's really interesting to talk about and think about. I wanted to think a little bit about the connection in the linguistics as well, and again, I'm going to probably draw upon your knowledge on this, Roy, because you are the dwarven linguist.
I'm just enjoying hearing Roy talk about all this, like this behind the scenes, and like I've been waiting for the language part, so I'll just listen with rapt attention, like everyone else.
So my understanding is that Khuzdul, and I asked Mr. Hostetter, I had Carl Hostetter on recently, we were talking about Elvish languages, and I sort of, one of my questions I wanted to ask was, what about all the other languages? How much is there of all these other languages? And his answer was, there's not very much Khuzdul at all. There's very, very little. But what we do have is a suggestion that it might be loosely based on Hebrew. And that Tolkien was considering the Jewish people as sort of a slight inspiration behind the dwarves. And how did that play into the way that they evolved over the course of these 4 generations of the dwarves, as you put it? And how does the linguistics tie in with that as well?
Okay, well, what the evolution of the dwarves is concerned and their tie with the Jewish people, I think in the Hobbits, you at times still see what can I say, like a stereotype even of the image of pre-war Jews, which is their love of gold. The dwarves are not heroes, but a calculated folk with a great idea of value of money, is the quote from The Hobbit. That is, that links in there. Of course, there's this is often unjustly, in my view, used to for claims of anti-Semitism and whatnot. The reason that I think it's unjustly is the letter of 1938 that he sends to the German publisher, stating that reputing any such anti-Semite ideas. And making firm ground there that he wasn't a fan, let's say, of the establishment over there in Germany at that time.
As far as The Hobbit, these were fairy tale tropes that Tolkien was drawing upon that weren't explicitly connected to the Jewish people. It was the linguistics that I think was where he was making that connection. I would argue.
True. But there are other elements as well. I mean, in the Hobbit, that might not have been present at that time. But for instance, you find in the appendices when Thrain is told the news of Thror's death, that he tears his beard. This is a very Jewish custom, tearing clothes. When there's news of death in the family, for instance. But the Semitic language is clearly present there. I don't think this is debatable. I mean, Tolkien himself said their language is clearly Semitic. That is. I mean, there's quite a few winks, if you will, within the language directly to Hebrew, where we have, for instance, the Hall of Gabil Gadol. Gadol is great in Hebrew, and then you have Gabil, his great. So Tolkien's version of that. Gadol then becomes fortress, so it's a little bit of a wink there. But yet it's not a copy of Hebrew, and that is something that some people often think. It's like, he's borrowing stuff. No, actually, what I have noticed is that the structure of the language is clearly Semitic, and yet he uses Germanic influences to create words in Khuzdul. An example of that is Gamil. Gamil meaning old in Khuzdul. So you have the Semitic radicals GML, and that is from Germanic, because you will find Gumling, for instance, the name.
Yeah,
Gumling.
I was about to say that, gambling. Yeah.
That again, or even in Swedish, gammel is old. In Dutch, gammel means something very old, something, in tatters. There's a link. So he uses the structures you find in Semitic languages and kind of pours the Germanic sauce over them, so that all fits in nicely as well. But yes, clearly their language, and also for instance, the secrecy of their language is something you will find in the Jewish people as well. They treat their language as a language of lore by the end of the Third Age is again something very clearly present with the Jewish people. So yes, there are many links with both the Jewish people and their language to the dwarves.
Great answer. That's really interesting.
That is.
How was it that you came to sort of become interested in this, and how were you a linguist before you started becoming interested in the Dwarven language, or?
No, I mean, as a kid, I if I wasn't climbing trees and having mischief with my buddies, I was basically drawing maps and making up languages. I love that. I had no idea that was a thing. I didn't know conlanging existed. I just did it, and it was fun.
You're basically kind of doing what Tolkien did with the Elvish languages with Dwarven.
I had no idea that Tolkien existed even when I was that young. So, but yeah, I just enjoyed that. And the thing is, when I read The Hobbit, and there were certain words in there, not many though, but later. The phrase Baruch Khazad, I mean, I want to know what this means, I gotta look that up, find out what that means in detail, and just or little words, like when Gimli talks about the three mountains of Moria, and he says Shatur, and all the names and the stories behind it, and that's a thing. It's not just in some fantasies you will find names are just given willy-nilly. You will never see that with Tolkien, and that's what I love. A name has not just a little explanation, it has 4 pages each name of information, and that is brilliant. That is fantastic. You can build a world on every single name.
It has an essay attached to it, which will be released posthumously 50 years later. Yeah.
Well, it does. Yeah. So, but the thing is, when you then read that and you tumble down that rabbit hole, which is basically what it is, and then I had that interest in languages. Then I thought, okay, well, why has nobody ever expanded this and looked at, okay, how did Tolkien make words? And again, I will never know exactly how he did them, but you can find certain things that you say, like, for instance, the word Gamil is a very good example. You see Germanic roots in a Semitic word. So why not do the same thing with others? You have Tumun Zahar, so Zahar would mean building or house, for instance, Z-H-R. Okay, language is Aglab. That's like a non-specific noun, an idea noun. Okay, well, home is an idea. That's not, that's not a physical thing. Let's use that structure, take those letters ZHR from Tumun Zahar and Azhar, home, bam, new word created. And these kind of things, looking in those structures, looking at all those little elements, and it's not like you're willy-nilly making words. If I would do a disfavor to everybody if I, made up words just willy-nilly, I try to every time look at, okay, is this feasible? Is this something that sounds correct? Is this something that could work? Of course, again, we will never be able to get into the mind of Tolkien and how he made those words, but you can at least make the best attempt possible. So yeah, that's where it came from and where my vision on that is.
Awesome.
And sorry for the babbling.
No,
this
went
is
into
great.
babbling.
This is awesome. Yeah, this is why you're here. So I want to talk about a little bit about The Hobbit, and I think actually let's start off with, who is your favourite dwarf in The Hobbit? That's a nice simple question that we can all think about. And Roy, as you point out, you have talked quite a bit, so I'm going to start off with Matt here.
Okay, so specifically from The Hobbit, is that what you said?
Yeah, favourite dwarf.
Oh man,
or are they all just the same character?
It is a little. It's a little harder to distinguish them. I mean, obviously you have Thorin. You've got a few that kind of stick out. One of the ones that I love from the book is how Dory is always carrying Bilbo around. So I've always kind of related to that, like, being a dad of young kids, like carrying my kids around. We went on a trip recently and we were at a theme park. And so I was carrying our daughter around and I was like, I kind of felt like Dory a little bit. I was like, these kids are heavy, man. Like,
I had the same thing with my nephew the other day, actually.
Yeah. See, so like I can relate to Dory, like constantly carrying him around. And then, when they're, I think aren't they like giving him grief later because like he misplaces him or something? And it's like, it's like, when did that become his job to watch Bilbo the whole time? Yeah.
I like Glowin's one. I think it's his only line in The Hobbit that I can remember, where he says, "Oh, this guy," this referring to Bilbo, "this guy looks more like a grocer than a burglar."
Oh yeah, that's pretty great.
Which of course we're thinking about when we meet him in The Lord of the Rings later, and meet his son. More importantly, how about yourself, Roy? Did you have a favourite dwarf?
I think I just have to go with Thorin. I'm sorry. There's so many others that I think, oh yes, but the problem is Thorin gets so many lines. It's kind of hard not to like him after a while. Although, yeah, he does pull off some nasty business as well. So, but anyway, for me, Thorin,
he has that great deathbed speech, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but it's that, but it's also the moments of anger and stubbornness is awesome. I like. For me, seriously, it doesn't need to be the whole, the epic end, which is wonderful, by the way. That's, not what I'm saying. But for instance, Thorin's argument with Thranduil in chapter 8 of The Hobbit, where he's showing this anger and stubbornness, and basically any question that Thranduil asks him is, yeah, but we were starving. That's like talking to a teenager. Everything you ask, the result is pretty much the same that you're gonna get, and he knows it. And Thranduil is going nuts, And he said, "Well, you can stay there for 100 years. I don't care." That's and that's elements of this stubbornness and that anger, and the way he puts it, still, eloquently. It's not like in the movie where he starts swearing in Dwarvish. And that is nice. You can, it's a nice trait of being able to be angry and stubborn and being, you as a dwarf, and yet doing that politely. And that is one thing, honestly, that is often overlooked, I think, with dwarves, how polite they can be. How, even when they're extremely mad. Okay, there are exceptions, descendant of rats wasn't a nice compliment toward Bilbo. But I'm just saying that overall, this politeness and well-spokenness, and then again, the problem with Thorin is that he often thinks he's very important, and but it's an element that is often overlooked, and I like that. I very much like that, especially in Thorin.
And it's almost more enraging for the person that they're, like in Thranduil's shoe, like someone. It's one thing, like you said in the movies, how they just like yell back and forth and stuff, but like when you're polite and very stubborn, but you're not like raising your voice, it's more impressive to do it like that. Yeah.
And you can't really do anything against it. I mean, it doesn't matter what you do against it. When you go, you become angry, you don't become angry, it doesn't matter anymore.
It's like, you're not going to get under a dwarf skin, but man, they will get under yours, which is another great thing about dwarves. Now, I will say, so if we're talking like Hobbit characters, and we're also like wrapping in more of the story than just what falls in the pages of Hobbit, Dying Ironfoot is a big one that I really like, just because of his whole history, killing Azog, stuffing the pouch of money in his mouth and his beheaded head. Like, it's so cool. And then you've got, his later actions with during the War of the Ring and the battles with the Easterlings that's going on in Erebor, he defends who's it's a descendant of Bard. What's his Brand? Is it Brand?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So like King Brand, he like defends his fallen body and stuff. Like so he's another character that, if you're factoring in the larger legendarium as far as Hobbit characters, that might be cheating a little bit.
All-time best dwarf, I would say Dying Ironfoot indeed is up there.
Yeah.
Because he's this legendary dwarf. I mean, he was like a stripling at the Battle of Azar-Ulbizar, and earned his legend there, if you will. And then and he's also a character that clearly says his mind. Like, they are at the Battle of Azar-Ulbizar and that is over. And then he says to the king of the Longbeards, "We will not enter Khazad-dûm."
Yeah.
We will not. He's a dwarvish teenager at this point in time.
Right.
Okay, he has slain Azog, their great nemesis, if you will. But still, he's a very young dwarf, and he says to the king, "No, we're not doing this. We're not doing what you said we're gonna do. We're not, and you will not enter Khazad-dûm." I mean, come on, that is pretty impressive.
There's a Balrog in there, guys. Come on.
Yeah.
Use our brains.
So very legendary dwarf.
And he has a red axe, which sounds amazing. It's a crime that we didn't get that in the films, by the way.
I think we did, didn't we?
I don't remember that.
He had like a hammer.
It was a red hammer in the Hobbit movies.
He had a mattock,
They have like concept art for the axe, which I think looks awesome. Like, I would have loved to see the red axe, but
right.
Yeah.
Great character. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I think he was well portrayed in the movie, actually, by Billy Connolly. I think it was a nice piece of casting.
You can't, for me, you can't fault Billy Connolly. Huge Billy Connolly fan. It's just,
me too.
Dear Mr. Connolly, I saw your otherwise excellent show. What a pity you descended to the dwarf story. I, personally, am a member of the Tall Dwarf Society. I'm 6'4".
So I did appreciate that casting, but we could have had even more of him, I think, than we got.
Yeah.
I would like to see some sort of adaptation of the story of the war in the North during the War of the Ring, actually, because it would be great to see that and see him in action there, alongside the descendant of Bard, as we talked about, because it's an interesting storyline that we could be interesting to see in an adaptation in the future. If Amazon's franchise branches out that far, maybe we will. But
if nothing else, it would make a great mini series, maybe, or something like that.
That's the thing with so many Tolkien stories. You could make miniseries upon miniseries upon miniseries, really. You
Yeah.
could.
Yeah, it's never ending. Do we have any other sort of favorite dwarf moments from the Legendarium? I think there's one that is a big standout that I think probably you guys are probably going to think of, but I'm going to lead with it and cheat, which is the Azagal moment.
Yes. Okay. Yep.
In the it's in the Neonaithar Noiriad, I think.
Yes.
And it's the moment where the dwarves are beating back the dragon and they're kicking ass and taking names, and then their leader is killed. And they stretcher him out of the battle and leave without saying a word. They leave and just march through the elves and just, sorry guys, we're out. Which is a great epic moment. It's wonderfully described in the Silmarillion.
And none of their enemies attack them during this time. Like,
no, they don't dare.
they're like, yeah, they don't dare attack
But
them.
that
Which
says
is crazy.
already enough, you know. You have like, I don't know how many dwarves carrying him on their shields out of the battle, you know, and then nobody dares attack them, and it's in the middle of the battle.
Yeah,
And
mean,
it's
it
just
kinda
that
says
sheer
enough what these-
belligerence again, you know?
Yes,
But yeah, so that's mine, I think. As a Silmarillion fan, I can't not go to that one. Do we have any other favorite moments for dwarven history and lore in Middle-earth?
Yeah, I think what I would one of the pieces in Lord of the Rings I really enjoy is when Gimli describes the beauty of the glittering caves to Legolas. It shows how different dwarves can be, because Gimli's a poet. That's it. He's a poet, you know. And when he starts describing that to Legolas and putting it in his world, you know, as talking about you wouldn't cut trees in the same way in spring and all that, you know, kind of transporting his views or Legolas' point of view, if you will, into his story, and doing that in a poetic way. That honestly, I think, yeah, that shows again. You think you know dwarves, well, then you see this, and then again, there's a new bit there that deepens them once more. So yeah, that it probably. Yeah, as we've talked about before, the Thorin's argument with Thranduil in Chapter 8 of The Hobbit, still a favorite there. But apart from that, yeah, Gimli's description of the glittering caves to Legolas, you know.
Yeah, I think that's a great one. Yeah, good choice. Gimli is a romantic at heart, isn't he? In many ways, we see that in his devotion to Galadriel and how that changes him as well. But I think he was a gem amongst dwarves even before that. Matt, did you?
Yeah. So you're actually kind of leading into it here. So I took a minute because I was wrapped up in the Azagal thing. But so sticking on Gimli, just the whole. I remember being blown away when because I came to the books through the films, and I saw the extended edition of Fellowship, and you have this thing. Gimli says she gave me 3. Strands of her hair, and I'm like, okay, well, that was nice. He only asked for 1, she gave him 3. I guess that's nice, kind of an odd thing to ask for. But then, when I learned the deeper story there, going back to Feanor, and him asking 3 times for a tress of her hair, and so for her on 1 ask from Gimli to give him 3, kind of validates the worth that she sees and the worthiness of Gimli. And, Dan, you kind of alluded to it. I love how Gimli is ready to throw down with anyone who says anything bad about Galadriel from that moment on. Éomer, it's on, Wormtongue, it's on. Let's do this. I'm going to chop you down with my axe if you dare say anything about the Lady of the Golden Wood. And
the running banter between Gimli and Éomer in Lord of the Rings is I think it's the main reason why I often defend the portrayal in the movies of him being quite a comedic character, because he is funny in the books.
He is, yeah.
In a different way, but he's funny.
Yeah.
And that moment at the wedding of Aragorn and Arwen, I think it's at the wedding where he says, "Well, you've seen the Lady Galadriel, and and now you have to you have to admit
Like
that
I'm still ready to throw down,
Yeah. And AMS says, well, no, I have to say the Lady Arwen, and Gimli concedes in the end. But yeah, just I love the banter there.
Yeah. So good.
So I think we're going to draw to a close shortly, but there's two more things I want to cover. So I'm going to get to our final kind of point of discussion in a minute, but I wanted to touch on the dwarven rings and what we think the dwarven rings are all about and what's going on with those, because that's really, really interesting too, because they seem to have a very different effect on the dwarves than for the other races. They don't have the effect of they don't seem to have the effect of making them more transparent or extending their lifespans or anything like that, but they did have the effect of creating these 7 hordes. The dwarves who got these dwarven rings became fabulously wealthy, but they were also driven kind of mad by it. And so I just wanted to talk about why is it that is the direction that we went in with that? What was Sauron's plan there? And why did Tolkien take the dwarves in that direction in terms of their backstory with the rings?
I think the fact that it has a completely different effect to them is not a coincidence. It's in their design, if you will. Aulë or Mahal, as the dwarves call them, made them sturdy, unyielding to the powers of Melkor, and unwilling to endure the domination of others. And it's in their design, if you will. So if you get this ring, and one of the characteristics of the ring is, or of one of those rings of powers, is that it slowly corrupts you for a creature that is very sturdy and unyielding, then that is going to have a completely different effect. Why some of these elements are different is open for debate, but I think that is at least one source of that being very different with dwarves and with other creatures.
And that goes back to their origins, because of the fact that they're not Eru's children of creation, they're his adopted children, and Aulë created them, I think. They have a different nature.
It advances also their bad traits, if you will. They are greedy, they are stubborn and secretive, and they make the possession of these rings enhances this greed and their secretiveness, making large piles of hoards inside their halls. So I think it enhances that, as well as your bad characteristics would be enhanced for other creatures as well. I think
it's very similar to the dragon sickness that we see in Thorin in The Hobbit, which makes me wonder if perhaps Smaug actually had devoured one of the dwarven rings, and maybe that's going on there. That's my kind of tinfoil theory about that. But
actually, that might not be too far from. I don't know if it's the truth or not. We will never know. But we do know that 4 rings were devoured by dragons. We don't know which dragon that was.
Yeah.
So you never know. Smaug might have had a different chapter in the east and gobbled up one of their rings. Who knows?
Yeah.
Actually, the connection between the dragons and the dwarves is fascinating too, because we talked about earlier how the dwarves have this sense of money, and they can always tell what the value of something is. In The Hobbit as well, we're also told that dragons know the exact monetary value of their hoard down to the penny, almost, I think it says, which is very similar.
Yeah.
And when you go back to Norse mythology, you have the legend of Sigurd and Fafnir, and a dwarf becomes a dragon in that storyline, which makes me wonder about the origins of dragons in Tolkien's mythology, which we know very little about, other than we know that Melkor created them, but we don't know by what mechanism he did so. Interesting connection between those two races, and lots of untold stories there again.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of like the dragons are the absolute worst of dwarves, like taken to its extreme. I will say, when we're speaking about the rings of power, it's interesting how all of the rings really, you know, they kind of prey on and affect the, you know, I guess you could say like the deepest desire of its wearers, like by race. You know, you think of the ring wraiths, the men who were come to covet immortality, and it gives them that immortality, but it's at a heck of a cost, and they're slaves to Sauron now. And maybe that was Sauron's intent with the dwarven rings as well, but obviously their hardiness, you know, prevented that from happening. But it did, you know, afford them the opportunity to amass great riches, and it kind of fed off that greed that they had, and then brings destruction upon them in the form of the dragons. And then even the elves, I mean, they're not totally separate from Sauron's influence, because, you know, what do the elves want? They want to preserve their beautiful realms that they've come to Middle Earth and, you know, fostered. And so they're even, you know, kind of, you know, going against the natural, you know, way of the world. You know, these lands would, you know, change and, you know, but they're preserving them kind of unnaturally. So it's just an interesting, you know, how the whole rings of power affect the different races, but they definitely have, you know, I feel like they definitely kind of target, you know, the in particular races, you know, their deep desires.
Yeah, there's an element of design there. I think that's true. Yeah. Cool. So last point of discussion that we have to cover is the long-standing beef between the elves and the dwarves. And so you knew we were coming to this. So my question to both of you is, whose fault is that beef, and why is it the fault of the elves? Whoever wants to go in first can go in. But I have to talk to Matt about this because I know you've got some thoughts on this.
Well, I'm trying to remember. I mean, if you're going purely chronologically, the first grievance would be the elves hunting the dwarves, I would think.
Agreed.
I mean, so you can't make a case for elves based on purely chronologically, because they were hunting dwarves like animals before anything else happened.
And you have to think, how did they make that mistake? Because dwarves are clearly sentient creatures. I mean, how did they manage to mess that up?
Yeah. And they hunted them, and then of course the question is, did they eat them because they hunted them? You know, that makes matters even worse.
Like, or is it like a hunting in the case of like orcs? Like, are they just like going after them? Like, these are bad guys, so we're gonna. Kill them.
But then they would know that they are sentient creatures as well,
right? Yeah,
you know you know. Yeah, I'm just saying it's maybe it's a can we don't want to open. I don't know.
Yeah, the sentience of orcs is definitely something that I don't want to open because we'll be here all day. But I mean, certainly the first grievance is with the dwarves because they were hunted, and the Silmarillion interestingly says that. And as I said before, the Silmarillion is written from an elvish perspective. It's clearly got a slant, and it's got a kind of unreliable narrator thing going on. But the elves are even you know, are honest about that. I would think that it would probably say if they were eating them, and that would be there would be consequences to that. But I mean, it's natural to wonder. I think. Obviously, we get the storylines later on. I mean,
the main thing most would think of is the whole, King Thingol murder, destruction of Doriath is the key. But then again, that story, and Tolkien says that himself, that's not what the dwarves say. So, and that is, again, that lovely, but there's a different story here. But, that might not be the truth. Who knows? And that kind of putting a question mark on that whole thing by this, that's not what the dwarves say. So what happened? Because, the Silmarillion is purely from an elvish perspective. And is that the case? Is that not the case? Thingol saying, well, it would be lovely if you can put that Silmaril in the Naugrim. That would be absolutely fantastic. Oh, you're done. Okay, well, give it back to me. Oh, you don't want to give it back? Oh, Yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of. It's hard to believe.
Yeah.
Is it maybe he didn't want to pay them for the work? I don't know.
Yeah.
Who knows?
It could be.
He was dead by the time they wrote it. Who knows?
I mean,
I do like the idea that there's different cultural dynamics at work too, like because the dwarves kind of see it as, truly belonging to them. For one, the Naugrimir they made. And like, this is weird. I know, obviously we're talking about Tolkien here, but I always think of, if either of you are familiar with Harry Potter, like they say that, goblins, when they make a craft, they believe that it's truly belongs to them, even if they made it for someone else, like it should be returned to them. So I always think of that connection. Like I feel like there's, a similar aspect at play with the dwarves and the Naugrimir, that's potentially a cultural barrier that is potentially at the root of that. Maybe the dwarves just saw it and they're like, hey, this is really pretty, let's take this back, and Thingol's like, no, and then all heck breaks loose. But
but that's the elvish point of view.
That's true.
But one thing though, the whole beef with the elves, to be honest, it's a little bit exaggerated, because, at least from my point of view, because if you see, we hear this from, for instance, Gimli versus Legolas, kind of this dynamic, but that was also a very personal thing. I mean, Gloin, Gimli's father, Thranduil, Legolas' father, their history wasn't all fine and dandy as well. Right. So there was a personal rift in between those families already. And then, for instance, you have when Lake Town was refounded, it says dwarves and elves were friends. You have the Eregion Khazad relationship, again, worked out nicely. With the Finrod Felagund, for instance, where you got a dwarvish name, Felagkundu. Azagal and Medros, Medros is swearing allegiance to Medros and giving him the dragon helm of Dorlomin. I'm just saying, there's so many elements in this, and even at the end of the Third Age, it says pretty much that dwarves and elves got along, at least in Lake Town, and so why would that be a unique thing?
Right.
So I don't know.
It's mostly always the Longbeards that do get along with the elves. They seem to be the dwarven clan of elf friends within the dwarven world. But then again, we don't know that much about all the others, really.
Well, the Broadbeams, if those are indeed the Broadbeams, that's another debate. But the ones that were in Belagost, in Gabil Gatol, were standoffish with the whole, the Nogrod dwarves charging in with the whole Doriath story. So again, they seen as the guilty party? Probably not, because they weren't really involved. They were standoffish with this whole thing. So, and to be honest, what do we know of the Stiffbeards, the Iron Fists, the Blacklocks, the Stonefoots? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. So, okay, to what extent is there beef with the elves in fantasy in general? A lot, because it's a really nice thing to work into a story. You have two parties that really don't get along on so many levels. It's fun. It's it works on so many levels. And but is it really the what can I say? Is it really that heavily present in? Let's say at the end of the Third Age, I don't know. Between Gimli and Legolas, yes, but there's again a private affair going on there. That might not be the case with all dwarves and elves.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting when you consider the different, as Roy said, the different dwarf clans, but then you've also got the different elf clans that seem to treat dwarves differently. Like Elrond is very welcoming to dwarves. When he brings, they sing, his elves sing the songs about him and stuff, but he has them over for dinner and stuff. So, but then
Galadriel, very good example. Of being extremely welcoming.
Right.
Even before she ever meets Gimli, she's friendly with the dwarves of Khazad.
Which is it the link between the Noldorim and then Aulë, of course, and the dwarves, that works out. I think, that's probably one of the reasons there. Perhaps even the reason why the location of Eregion was where it was, right next to Khazad. I mean, okay, Mithril was there, but
I think Mithril had a lot to do with it. I think.
Yeah. For sure, yeah.
But those two groups have a lot in common, and we see that all the way through the mythology. Actually, the Noldor and the dwarves trying to get along at times. Other times, it's kind of a marriage of convenience. You think about Caranthir in the First Age and how he was right next to the dwarves.
Yeah,
but we're told
profiting with the trade routes.
Yeah, he was getting rich basically. He had a whole kind of side hustle there in the siege of Angband, and he was just lining his pockets with the dwarves. But he didn't like the dwarves. He just tolerated them because he needed them. But the dwarves also built that nice road all the way through Beleriand, which was useful for elves and men. All right, so I'm going to draw things to an end here, I think. Thanks so much, guys. This has been really good fun. Really, really good fun.
Thank you for having me. It was really fun. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
You're both welcome back anytime. I'm going to give you both a chance to just plug whatever you're doing on your various spaces. So I'm going to start off with Matt, I think. People know you, I think, who know me, but go ahead and tell us what you've got coming up on your channel.
My channel on YouTube is Nerd of the Rings. I haven't planned as far ahead. I'm here in the next couple weeks. I'm going to try to map out the rest of my calendar year, but I've probably by now, when this releases, will just be wrapping up a series on the Rings of Power, ironically enough, since we were talking about that earlier. And I'm sure there'll be a dwarvish video somewhere in there, because I can't go too long without talking about the dwarves.
Roy, have you got anything you're working on, anything you want to plug or talk about?
Well, I would say
you do a lot of lessons, don't you? I think for people that want to learn about Neo Khazad.
I do. The thing is, though, I've put a lot of those on the YouTube, but they were in desperate need of updating. And sadly, my time is not always as rich and available as I would love it to be. But but I am working on a brand new series in Neo Khazad lessons, which I'm not going to set a date because it might be later, but it's going to be soonish. Let me put it that way. So if people have an interest in that, I would just say head over to dwaroscholar.com, and then you'll just find the necessary links there, and we'll guide you there.